Hello Year 7 and welcome to today's lesson. Before we start a knowledge retrieval task, when we do an assessment, if we do an assessment on this unit, you'll be writing out one of the poems that we've studied. What I'd like you to do is, at the back of your book, without looking at your notes, I'd like you to note down as much as you can remember about the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. It's the first poem that we looked at. As much as you can remember about the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. Think about the narrative of the poem, think about what happens, think about some of the imagery, the similes, the metaphors, as much as you can remember. And you can write those down in bullet points. When you finish that, move on to the next task. So here is a rather pixelated picture of a Victorian woman. Now I'd like you to think about what we've studied so far about Victorian women. Think about the work we did on By the Sea. Have a think about what the rest of this image might contain. Where might she be? What other people might be there? What might she be doing? So note down your thoughts before moving on to the next slide. Pause the video. Don't click the button yet. Be honest. What do you think you're going to see? And here is a very unusual image. This Victorian woman is standing in the middle of a wilderness, wearing her rather restrictive Victorian dress, staring out at what appears to be the top of a mountain. And this image might have unsettled people at the time. Why might it have done that? Well, it might have done that because Victorian society didn't expect women to go on adventures. They expected women to stay at home, look after their families, to be wives and mothers. The idea of a woman travelling the world and exploring strange new places was a really challenging one for Victorian society, not just men, but Victorian women, to get their heads around. The idea of being an adventuress was something that could be regarded as quite scandalous. Today, we're going to think about how language is used by this particular woman, who was a woman called Isabella Bird, in her writing. And we're going to think about how a woman in the 19th century tried to capture the experience of doing something that women were not supposed to do. So you're going to spot a range of language devices. You're going to identify where these devices are used and explain why they're used. A bit of background information about Isabella Bird, and your title is Isabella Bird. At a time when a few women would leave their houses alone, Isabella Bird braved war, floods, and male scorn to complete arduous solo journeys in America and the Far East. Arduous means difficult. From 1894 to 1897, the Victorian explorer trekked across China while it was at war with Japan, documenting the lives of the men and women she met through detailed written accounts and a collection of vivid photographs, and that comes from the Daily Mail. What personal qualities might Isabella Bird have needed to achieve all this? So I'd like you to jot down 3 personal qualities that you think Isabella Bird might have needed. For example, you might put resilience, and I'd like you to explain why. So, for example, you might put Isabella Bird would have needed to show resilience because she would have faced many difficulties on the journey which might have stopped her. If you've used resilience, I'd like you to try and pick 2 more personal qualities that she might have needed. You might use bravery. You might want to choose a willingness to challenge authority. You might want to choose an idea about feminism or something like that. Why might Isabella Bird be a good role model today? We are about 150 years after Isabella Bird. Why do you think she might be seen to be a good role model today? What might modern people learn from Isabella Bird? For example, you might say that people can learn a spirit of adventure from Isabella Bird, being willing to break convention and do things that people don't usually do. And that might be an example of why she's a good role model. Try and think of one more, or if you can, come up with 2 of your own. Please write those in full sentences. When you've done that, move on to the next slides. I'm now going to read to you a description of Isabella Bird's arrival in Japan. Now, Japan was a country that was quite unusual at the time because not many people from England or from the West or from Europe had been there. So for Isabella Bird, it was a really adventurous experience. Whilst I'm reading this to you, what I'd like you to do is I'd like to try and spot at least three quotations which describe what Isabella Bird saw. So what you might need to do is you might need to pause the presentation, you might need to pause the video as I'm reading and make sure that you've written these down. So three quotations which describe what Bird saw. Oriental Hotel, Yokohama, May 21st. 18 days of unintermitted rolling over desolate rainy seas brought the city of Tokyo early yesterday morning to Cape King, and by noon we were steaming up the Gulf of Yedo, quite near the shore. The day was soft and grey, with a little faint blue sky, and though the coast of Japan is much more prepossessing than most coasts, there were no startling surprises either of colour or form. Broken wooded ridges, deeply cleft, rise from the water's edge. Grey, deep-roofed villages cluster about the mouths of the ravines, and terraces of rice cultivation, bright with the greenness of English lawns, run up to a great height among dark masses of upland forest. The populousness of the coast is very impressive, and the gulf everywhere was equally peopled with fishing boats, of which we passed not only hundreds but thousands in 5 hours. The coast and sea were pale, and the boats were pale too, their hulls being unpainted wood, and their sails pure white duck. Now and then a high-sterned junk drifted by like a phantom galley. Then we slackened speed to avoid exterminating a fleet of triangular-looking fishing boats with white square sails, and so on through the greyness and dumbness hour after hour. Looking heavenwards, I saw Fujisan. It was a huge, truncated cone of pure snow, 13,080 feet above the sea, from which it sweeps upwards in a glorious curve, very wan, against a very pale blue sky, with its base and the intervening country veiled in a pale grey mist. It was a wonderful vision, and shortly as a vision vanished. The air and water were alike motionless. The mist was still and pale. Grey clouds lay restfully on a bluish sky. The reflections of the white sails of the fishing boats scarcely quivered. It was all so pale, wan, and ghastly that the turbulence of the crumpled foam which we left behind us, and our noisy, throbbing progress, seemed a boisterous intrusion upon sleeping Asia. Just a few things that might need clarifying. The city of Tokyo is the steamer that she's on. That's a steamboat that she's travelled to Japan on. The She describes the coast of Japan, which is forested with little villages and plenty of people living there. Is what she means by populousness. When she describes the fishing boats as their sails pure white duck, she's talking about a particular shade of white, which is described as duck. A high-sterned junk. A junk is a kind of boat that was used in the Far East, both in China and Japan, with a particular shaped hull and particularly shaped sails. Fujisan is Mount Fuji. It was a very famous volcano in Japan. When she uses the word wan, she describes things as wan. It's another word for pale, looking very sort of white. So if you've got wan skin, it looks like you're very white. So if you weren't able to do this while I was reading you the description, what I'd like you to do is now find three examples of quotations which describe what Bird saw. So you need to find three quotations which describe what she saw. I'd like to copy the quotation out if you didn't do that already, I'd like to explain how you think Isabella Bird felt when she saw that thing. For example, quite early on, she describes viewing the coast of Japan. She says, "The coast of Japan is much more prepossessing than most coasts. There were no startling surprises, either of colour or form." Now, this suggests that she found the coast of Japan interesting. The word prepossessing means kind of interesting, has a little bit more to it, but he says there were no startling surprises either of colour or form. So she basically said, although it's interesting, it isn't very different to other coasts that she had seen. So it wasn't as alien as she was expecting. So that is my example. I'd like you to find 3 other quotations that describe what she saw. Think about the fishing boats, think about Mount Fuji, think about the sea, think about the words that she uses, the colours she mentions. Have a think about how she felt. So 3 quotations describing what she saw. Explain for each how you think she felt. When you've done that, move on to the next slide. What I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to look back at the passage again, and this time I want you to think about finding quotations which suggest that Bird was excited about her arrival. So see if you can find any quotations that suggest Bird felt excited about arriving in Japan, and try and identify the words that demonstrate that she feels excited. And then see if you can find a quotation that suggests that Bird was nervous about arriving in Japan. And again, explain which words tell you that she might have been nervous. An example I've used here is when she saw Fuji, Mount Fuji. I saw Fuji-san. It was a huge truncated cone of pure snow, 13,080 feet above the sea, from which it sweeps upwards in a glorious curve. It was a wonderful vision. And the words glorious and wonderful, they're both really positive. They're both really suggesting that what Bird was feeling was excitement at seeing this incredible sight. So those 2 words tell me that she was excited, glorious and wonderful. So what you need to do is you need to find an example of something that Bird writes which includes words that tells you that she was excited. I've used the quotation, "The reflections of the white sails of the fishing boats scarcely quivered. It was all so pale, wan, and ghastly." And those 3 words, pale, wan, and ghastly, they all suggest something frightening. They all suggest something that makes Bird nervous, particularly the word ghastly, which suggests something unpleasant or frightening. So I think that word implies that Bird might have been nervous. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like to find 2 examples, one showing that Bird was excited, one that shows that Bird was nervous. If you really can't find any others, you can use my examples, but only if you can't find any others. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to choose 2 of the words below. These are all words that are taken from the passage, and I'd like you to create what's called a meaning triangle. Now what you'll need to do is you'll need to draw that triangle in your book. It will take about a page or half a page, and you start at the bottom with the word, and you write the word underneath the triangle, and then you need to write its literal meaning. So what does the word actually mean? I'll show you an example of this on the next slide. Then you need to write the connotations and what ideas does that word, that word evoke? How does that word make you feel? And then the figurative meaning. What could the word be a metaphor for? What could that word stand for? So as opposed to its literal meaning, what could its figurative meaning be? So you're going to do this twice. You're going to do this for 2 of those words. So this is what it might look like. If you chose the word mist, what is the literal meaning of mist? Well, it is a fog. So the literal meaning of mist is fog. So you would write fog. And what are the connotations of mist? Well, when we think about mist, we think about things clouding our vision. We think about things getting in the way. So connotations of mist are of being lost, of being uncertain, of being nervous. So what might a metaphor be? Well, it might be a metaphor for a fear of the unknown. So that's what I'd like you to do. Please don't copy this one. Please don't do mist. Please choose one of the other word, two of the other words, and then when you've done your triangle, I'd like you to move on to the last task. I've just put this slide in again to remind you of the words you can choose. So these are vision, blue sky, forest, phantom, white, and grey. When you've completed two of those words, you move on to the final task. You are going to become Isabella Bird. I want you to imagine that you are on a journey you've taken to somewhere new. Now, this might be an actual journey that you've been on, or you could use your imagination and make up a journey. And I want you to think about the arrival. So, your arrival at this new place that you've never been before. And I want you to describe your arrival in the most interesting way that you can, using the most interesting descriptive language that you can. Think about how Isabella Bird described her arrival in Japan. I want you to imagine that you are arriving somewhere new. Use the descriptive language to make your experience clear to the reader. Try and help them experience what you experienced. Now, you should aim to write no fewer than 2 paragraphs. I would say at least a half a side of an exercise book. You can write more if you wish, and I know there are some of you who love to write, so don't feel that you have to write only 2 paragraphs, but I want at least 2 paragraphs. This should take you about 10-15 minutes to do. When you've completed this task, I'd like you to photograph your work. You should have your knowledge retrieval activity. You should have your quotes from Isabella Bird's arrival in Japan, your analysis of those quotes, and your word triangles, and your journey arrival paragraphs. When you photograph them, please upload them. Make sure that they've attached. Then turn your work in, and that is it.